Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today is Friday, September 18th, and this is our 26th episode. Today I'm joined by Jen Baird of Fifth Eye, and after that we're going to tell a story of hazards, continuing on our discussion of risk management and FDA-cleared medical devices. So without further ado, I want to stop the share of this title slide and welcome Jen to the show. Jen Baird, co-founder and CEO of Fifth Eye Inc. Jen, welcome.
Hello, Gene.
It's good to see you. Thanks for being with us today. Oops, let's see. Do I still have your audio?
Well, it's great to see you and everybody else.
Oh, there we go. We just had a little audio blip there when you came on, so I apologize for that. So Jen was the co-founder and CEO of Accuri Cytometers, the U of M spinout that created a low-cost cytometer and then exited to Becton Dickinson very successfully. She's now the co-founder and CEO of Fifth Eye, a medical device software company, bringing their Analytic for hemodynamic instability through the FDA to the market. With many startups and mentorships, and you're a speaker, panelist, guest lecturer, you're a deep member of the entrepreneurial ecosystem here, Jen. Your bio says occasional angel investor and VC limited partner. Mm-hmm. And I love something you say in your bio. You say, I don't know of many startup CEOs who are this transparent. You say, my outcomes have ranged from startups who achieved global sales and 10x revenue exits, and we all know that's very true, to the difficult decision to wind down and return capital to the investors and other points in between. And I just think that's such a beautiful way of putting the whole thing right out there. And from that, Jen has been, along with her current endeavor of Fifth Eye, she's been maintaining a blog at startupceoreflections.com, where, Jen, you've just been unpacking topic after topic that are of interest to entrepreneurs and investors. And really, I think it's near and dear to my heart because we love this very holistic view of this community, this holistic view of what we're all engaged in together. And that's what you're taking at your blog. So I encourage our listeners today to go out and look at that at startupceoreflections.com. But I wanted to dive into one of those blog posts with you. You have about 1 million on there that are just wonderful. One of them caught my eye.
Variation in sound.
One more time.
I'm running into some sound variation problems.
Oh, yeah, I keep having you block up. I wonder if one of our other attendees, like Aaron, can tell us if we've who you're hearing having problems.
Join the call a different way.
Yeah, I think I hear Gene. I hear you, Jen. You're a little choppy sometimes.
Jen, let's have you call back in.
I'm going to call back in, so you can.
Yep. Sounds good. We'll hear you in a minute.
Yep.
Right now, you're actually quite smooth.
Right now, well, we can keep going while I act on the whole call in and give us an alternative, because
you can dial in on a phone there while you're doing that.
A little.
No, that's okay. Gotta love the wonders of technology. This is probably a good time to have a discussion about. No, she's broken up again. We're going to have Jen call back in there, and we will get going again when she comes back. And if you just joined us, we got a little technical difficulty here. Jen's calling back in to be with us here.
I am mute.
Okay, can we hear you now? No, you're muted. Just unmute and you'll be fine. Still not hearing you. Looks like you're muted.
I'm muted on my computer.
Oh, so you could call in on the phone. Okay.
Called in on my phone, which is 4800.
Got it. We're going to allow 4800 to talk. Let's try that. Can we hear you now, Jen? The phone appears to be muted. Well, as you can tell, we're having a few technical difficulties here. We're going to try to work through those. Talking is permitted on that phone. Can you unmute the phone by any chance? Try *6 on your phone, Jen. Try *6 on your phone.
How's that?
Yay!
Yay!
We can hear
Technology,
you.
we can do it.
Maybe I get Aaron and Steve to confirm that everybody can hear us.
Yeah.
All right.
Better now.
That's great.
Awesome.
Well, this is
Sorry about
this is
that,
you know this is
everybody.
actually no, it's just totally fine. It's very instructive because this is the nature of new endeavors, right? When you set out and you want to do something, you always I think you've got one about when a bridge falls across your path. So I'm going to encourage everybody to go read that one when a bridge falls across your path, and we just
It's a tree,
demonstrated.
but that's okay.
I'm sorry, a tree falls across your path. It wouldn't be nice if it was a bridge. Okay, we're going to back
I
up
would like
just a little bit for those who are going to be listening to this afterwards. So today, now that we got through the technical difficulties, I'm joined by Jen Baird, who is the co-founder and CEO of Accuri Cytometers, the U of M spin-out that created a low-cost cytometer and exited to Becton Dickinson in a wonderful exit. And she's now the co-founder and CEO of Fifth Eye, a medical software company bringing their Analytic for hemodynamic instability through the FDA to market. And welcome to the show, Jen.
Thank you very much, Gene.
It's really great to see you. So I love your bio. You really lay out on your startupceoreflections.com blog, where you've somehow found the time to talk about all of the different lessons that you've learned over the years and all the things you want to talk to the community about. And I love your intro of your bio. You say serial entrepreneur with nearly 2 decades of experience founding and leading high potential startups as a CEO, venture and angel backed, speaker, panelist, guest lecturer on startup best practices, entrepreneurial ecosystem mentor, occasional angel investor and VC limited partner, follower of Jesus. And down the page, you say, my outcomes have ranged from startups who achieved global sales and 10x revenue exits to the difficult decision to wind down and return capital to the investors and other points in between. There's not a lot of people who would say that publicly, be that transparent about all the successes, all the failures,
it's true.
everything in between. It's true for everybody. And I think that's what makes this so refreshing is everyone has the highs and the lows. And of course, out of both of those, you really bring a holistic view to what works when it comes to startups and fundraising, and managing teams. And I want to encourage our audience to go look at your blog, startupceoreflections.com, where you work through a bunch of these different issues and you continue to. I think you told me that you were on a 1 per week blog posting spree, and I think maybe now is it 1 per week now, or was it every couple days? How often were you doing this?
It was, for a while I was doing 2 per week, and then I backed off to 1 per week because it was becoming too intense for the time that I had to give it. So backed off to 1. I had to get permission though, because I'm a little driven that way.
Someone had to tell you you can back off and only do 1 per week. I love it.
Yeah, I needed that. I had to. It was my VP of engineering. He's like, "Look, you can do 1 per week. Nobody will care." I'm like, "Ah, good point."
I don't know. After they read it, they might, because this is good stuff. And today we're going to talk through a few of your blog posts, and then after that, we're going gonna work our way down and hear about Fifth Eye for those who don't know about the company.
Sure.
One of your blog posts that really caught my eye was the one that says, is entitled How VCs Say No. Now, you've been wildly successful over your career at raising funds. I have to believe a big part of it is just sort of the transparency that you bring to the whole process so people know what they're currently up against. And you do have two blog posts. One says How VCs Say Yes, and that's what everyone normally is asking for. I think it's really interesting to target on the one that says How VCs Say No, because most people would think, well, I don't want to know. I want a yes, and I have to win this, and I have to get a yes. Now, is that what about that attitude coming in? How's that strike you?
Well, you're just going to get a lot of no's, so you might as well know how to recognize it. That's the key, because your most precious resource is time. Your most precious resource is time. So if you can identify that somebody is saying no, then you can move on and be working on the ones that might say yes, because once they're saying no, you're unlikely to recover that. And I have had many, 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 many more no's than I have yeses, because it only takes a few yeses. And to get to a few yeses, you take a lot of no's. So I think it's the key to understanding no is that it's a question of VC's most limited resource is their time. And when they're saying yes, they're investing that time. And when they're saying no, they aren't investing that time. And so if they're saying things like, oh, we'd be interested in following your progress 8 months from now, that's a no for now. Now, it doesn't mean that 8 months from now you can't reach back out to them, but you should figure out that's a no and move on. Don't spend more time on that VC because it's not worth your time. And so I think I kind of use a 3 strikes rule. If I've tried to reach out at least 3 times and gotten no response, and usually I try and make sure of the 3 times there's at least 2 different methods of communication, because sometimes you're in a spam folder. But if somebody's not responding 3 times, then I'm like, okay, that's a no, moving on. And I think that the key to recognizing no is that you will be able to free up your time to focus on the potential yeses.
That's really powerful. You mentioned in your blog how there's sort of courteous VCs and less than courteous VCs, and you mentioned just there that sometimes you just don't hear back, and a lot of times we're tempted to think, well, I just haven't heard back, but it's still an iron in the fire. I can put some weight on that one. But you're saying no. No,
don't put the weight on that one. The ones that are interested will show that with their time and their intention. And I've gotten feedback on that blog post. Those quotes that are in that blog post, I took away some of the more identifiable features, but those are direct quotes. Those are straight out of an email within the last 18 months, for me. So some of them, oftentimes investors will set a goalpost out just one step beyond where you're at. And that's another way of saying no. And if that becomes a pattern, then you're like, we're never going to get there. I have another blog post that talks about that transition where, okay, you're not ready enough. Oh, you're too ready. And I'm like, how does that actually work? But it happens. And I think understanding the feedback that you're getting from the marketplace, because a lot of people don't want to be direct and they don't want to tell you no, and they don't want to tell you your baby's ugly. And it's really helpful to know if they think your baby's ugly, because then you should go find somebody who thinks your baby's cute.
You gave us one example of a way that a VC could say no by simply not responding and to not put any weight on that. Can you give us some other examples of, because there are probably listeners even on this call who are saying, yeah, I'm talking to a few VCs right now. I want to bin these in my mind. I want to know which ones do I think have a chance. Jen, help me, What other things, what should we be listening for in terms of this is heading in a good direction versus this is heading in we're really not interested direction?
I think the most common is the one that I said, which is they just go silent. And then there's some that are direct and they say, we don't see a fit. And a fast no is the second best thing to a yes, right? First is yes, second best is fast no, because it's the ones that drag it out that really drive me crazy, because they actually suck up a lot of your time and have very little likelihood of actually moving forward. I think the ones that are the best are the ones that actually tell you why they're saying no. And they give you a little bit of insight. The other thing that I think is a little nuance of no is you can get a lot of enthusiasm from an associate or even a managing director of a VC, but they have to convince their partnership. And I had one instance where I must have done a half dozen meetings with this VC. What I didn't pick up on was the fact that he wasn't talking to his partnership about us yet. And that was a no, and I didn't recognize it right away. I did recognize it when we first talked to the partnership, and it was 100% clear that he had not pre-sold this to his partnership and had not been bringing them along. And I should have been probably asking the question, so what do your partners think about this? Instead of taking all those meetings and figuring out, oh, you're not talking to your partners. That's actually a no, and I didn't see it. And I wasted a lot of time on that individual because of that. And that was a subtle one, right? That not realizing that they have to be selling, and if they're not selling through, then they're actually saying no, even if they're taking your meeting.
That's a fascinating one. That actually reminds me of an anecdote that we heard one time of a group that it's not even clear that they actually had funds behind them, and they kept the process moving, and then you realize there wasn't anything behind it. So that's a good counsel too, is you assume that the VC is reputable and is doing all the right things behind the scenes, but how do you know?
They might not be. And another one that's in a subtle category is talking to a VC that's fundraising. It's good for VCs who are fundraising to say things to the people that they're trying to raise money from, like, oh, just last week we talked to this really exciting company that's doing XYZ. So they want to keep having some meetings, just enough to have talking points. But the reality is they don't have the time or the energy to be focused on actually investing. And so they're wasting your time when they are fundraising. So one of the first questions I try to ferret out in an early call is, where are they in their fund life cycle? If they're at the point where they're fundraising, and if they're fundraising, when's their first close? If it's 6 months from now, they're not going to spend time on you or dig in, and you should see, like, great, we'll talk to you after your first close, because they don't have the time or the resources to do it, and they can be a great time suck. This also applies to angel groups. Angel groups can, you try and figure out what's their process look like, how likely are you to complete their process, and figure out what's the probability, because once again, it's a question of your time. You want to spend your time on the people who are likely to invest and figure out as quickly as possible those who aren't. And so you're looking for little signals that say, I don't actually have time for you. I don't actually have funds for you. I actually can't move forward in this investment, and then politely spend your time elsewhere.
They know that their most important resource is their time, and you should know yours is too, and use that in your
it's a very good way to put it.
That's really neat, Jen. I really like that. Let me ask one more quick question on that one before we move on to the other topic, which actually has personal relevance to me and something that happened recently. But is there anything in brief that we can do when we are in a no situation and we recognize it's a no, and there actually is some communication happening, to set this up for the potential of future engagement?
I think your professionalism in that moment will give you the opportunity in the future or not. And so don't you be the one to stop and drop your communication. I'm very appreciative. If somebody gives me negative feedback, tells me what's missing in my startup, and I've had all kinds of people say all kinds of things, I try to appreciate every bit of feedback. I may not act on their feedback. I may not agree with their feedback, but I appreciate the fact, their willingness to give it. So if somebody's actually willing to give me feedback, I appreciate that and appreciate them, and try to treat them with the professionalism I hope everybody treats everybody with, and close the loop and say thank you. And because I have absolutely seen it. Years later, people remember what you said. So you want to be the kind of professional that people say, okay, they handled that professionally and I'm going to watch it, because that absolutely happens. One of the things that happens in the VC fundraising is people, our lead investor at Fifth Eye was monitoring our progress. I talked to him before I even formed the company, when I was just starting to think about it. And we had been talking continually along the way and having a very open dialogue. And at one point he said, we're not ready to invest. This is too early for where we're at. We think you should go raise some angel money and then we'll look at it again. And so we maintained that open dialogue back and forth. And that's ideal. It's not ideal because I would have liked him to just invest. That would have been great. But it's ideal if you can actually have an open conversation about where you're at, where they're at, and what does it take to get across the finish line. That's the ideal way to handle it. And so I will ask the question, one, I'll thank them for the feedback, and two, I'll ask them, what is it that what would trigger it? What triggers should I be paying attention to reach out to again? Assuming it's somebody I like. There are some VCs I'm not actually interested in following up with, and I won't pursue that as strongly. But if there's somebody that I'm excited about, there's a VC right now on the East Coast that I am interested in for our Series B. Really like the way they're thinking about it. My other VCs are excited about them. And so we're setting up a cadence of calls every, for 4 months or so to keep them up to date. And that's something I'll invest in with a VC that I'm actually trying to cultivate.
Of course, it really is a partnership and something that goes well beyond just the money. So that seems to start right from the very outset. That's great.
Absolutely.
I encourage everyone to read How VCs Say No and How VCs Say Yes on Jen's blog, startupceoreflections.com. Well, so yesterday, Jen, I have to share this little anecdote. We got some fresh, hot data on behalf of a client. And I had just been looking at that next blog post that we're going to talk about. Watch out for fresh, hot data. And you've got a really cool story at the beginning of that blog post about some examples where you've had fresh, hot data walk through your office door. And you got these bullet points down below. And I had just been looking at this in preparation for today's show. And what went through my head is, oh, we've got fresh, hot data. And I started checking off these bullet points that you've got here. But explain to our audience for a minute, what do you consider to be fresh, hot data, and why is it so, not dangerous, but why is it so important to consider when you have it in your hands?
Well, it's dangerous, actually, but and it tends to be early results, incomplete data, something that's coming forth with a lot of energy around it. Like you actually care about this data. And that could be, I had it this week. We're getting ready for a board meeting. My team is trying to put together some analyses. We get the analysis and we're all looking at it and we're like, what are we talking about? And it was just not ready. We have not figured out what it means and how to talk about it. And so ultimately we made the decision, I'm listening to this and we're all talking about it. And I'm like, you know what, we're going to just leave the whole right side of that slide off. We're going to just take it to next time, because honestly, we don't know what it means yet. And it's too soon to act on. And it's too soon to talk about. And this is the dangerous thing. There's a hesitation step. Like this will happen, like we're in a place at Fifth Eye, we're waiting for the FDA to get back to us. When that FDA response comes in, every time the FDA response comes in, my board may not love it, but I don't tell them for like 2 days at least. 2 to 3 days I wait. Why? Because we don't understand the feedback on day 1. And we usually don't understand it on day 2. And by day 3, we might be getting a clue, because it's so dense and complicated that I want to give it a chance to settle, for us to respond. Oftentimes, fresh hot data is marked by a strong emotional response. We're either super excited or super depressed. What usually happens over time is you kind of come into a more neutral place. Whatever was super exciting becomes somewhat less exciting. Whatever was super scary becomes somewhat less scary. and that is, to me, one of the signs of fresh hot data is when we have this kind of like visceral response and we haven't had a chance to let it simmer down a little bit. And so my discipline as a CEO is to protect our team from letting that get out of the team. Now, in the team, we share it because that's how it gets processed. That's how we figure out what it means. But we talk about fresh hot data, and I try, this is a different example, but I keep a really regular cadence of communication with my investors. Every quarter, they get a report. They get the report the 30th day after the end of the quarter, every time. Why the 30th day? Because I know I'm going to report on last quarter's data, and by 30 days after the end of the quarter, whatever was the fresh hot data will have settled, and I will know what to say about it. The danger is if the end of the quarter was yesterday and I'm going to send out the report today, I'm going to be tempted to put in the thing that happened yesterday. And almost always that is a bad idea because we don't know what it means yet. So fresh hot data, the whole concept is realize that whatever that first impression is probably a little off, and you want to give it a chance for people to process and think about it. And that also puts a little definite. You ask, what is fresh hot data? Well, it's a big deal. You know, this isn't, did I get an email? That's not fresh hot data, depending on what it contains. But it's something that you care a lot about and have a really strong reaction to. And then you should make sure you let the team process it, let yourself process it before you start sharing it.
You know, it strikes me that the situation almost sets itself up to happen, that you would have a situation where you might have pressure to report on something because oftentimes we're working against deadlines that we want to hit that deadline because there's a reporting thing coming up that we'd like to hit. And so if we work really hard and we achieve that, and we achieve it just barely in time for that deadline, it almost does set up for that cycle to happen again and again, which then makes this not hesitancy, but caution very important, because we do find ourselves in this situation many times by the very nature of the development process.
Absolutely. And it is, you know, this is often the case when you're getting first feedback on a prototype. You know, first feedback on a prototype, oh, it looks really great, or oh, it looks disastrous. Well, it's usually not either really great or completely disastrous. It's somewhere in the middle. And you have to let a little bit of time and analysis and testing go on before you get a complete picture.
Yeah.
So it's a discipline as a leader to not immediately pick up the phone and say, this happened. Now, there are a few exceptions, but let me tell you how extreme they are. I did pick up the phone and call my board member when we had an employee die. That was a horrible moment, and that was fresh hot data that should not wait. But that's pretty much my limit. Like, if it actually has to do with data with a product, it can wait. They don't need to know today at this instant.
And it's so true. It was interesting to me that you noted like FDA responses as being one of those things, because we've noted many times, especially for clients, the first time they see an FDA letter and it comes back and here's the 10 things we want you to consider, here's the 5 things we want you to consider. The first read is like, oh my goodness, the world has melted down. No, let's read it again. Let's read it again. Okay, see that one there? They basically just asked you to change a word in your labeling. Can you do that? Yeah, we can do that. Okay. And I think it's that kind of a process where,
exactly right.
You know, you just got to process what they're actually saying and don't take the fact that there's words there as wholly positive or wholly negative.
I think the FDA is in our experience, one of the hardest things to process is their feedback, because it's written so densely. It's written in a particular style. They actually have essentially a style guide for this. I found, you know, it's out there. And when I read that after having read yet another letter from the FDA, I thought, oh, I see them following their model. Now I actually know what the model is. Now I can interpret it a little bit better. But the thing that's really challenging is you get feedback on a pre-submission document. Ours were usually like 50 pages. You get a 10-page document and you have 3 days to produce a presentation, which is crazy because it forces you into the process of processing fresh hot data. But in that case, I'm not going to talk to my board about, for example, what the FDA said until we've had a chance to process it, because it's just fraught, because all it does is undermine everybody's confidence, and you will work through it. And I think your example is really good. Can you change the word in the labeling? Probably. Do you even understand what it is they said? Sometimes it takes like 10 reads. And maybe then you understand. Or you have to go do some analysis to even try and figure out what are they talking about. Because the FDA comes at the world with a different point of view than we do. And oftentimes the way they're asking the question, you're like, I don't even understand the relevance of this question. Like, why are you even asking this? Like, that has nothing to do with what we're trying to do. And it takes a while to get into the headspace of what it is the FDA is talking to you about. And then you can kind of understand what their point of view is. And sometimes it's really helpful to get people's input like yours or Aaron's, who've seen a lot of, or our FDA consultants, who've seen a lot of FDA responses and have a better interpretation. So my current practice with FDA responses is, I get it, my FDA consultant sends it to me like that, and she'll tell me, I can meet on this, 36 hours from now. And we do absolutely, we read it, and we read it, and we read it, and we try and formulate our questions, but we don't interpret it or decide whether it's good, bad, or indifferent until we talk to her and say, where does this fall on the scale? Because what we've discovered is we do not have enough data in our own experience to interpret the FDA's response. Like, is this good or bad? I remember, we're in the middle of a de novo right now. I remember when we got our request for additional information, there were 9 major deficiencies. Our consultant was, this is great. And we're like, it's great? And she's like, this is great. And she said, I'm working on one from another client that's 37. And what's great about yours is every one of these 9 we can actually address. And I'm like, oh, okay. We have 9 major deficiencies, all of which we have answers for. So now we have to package those answers. But her reaction was totally different than mine, because mine was like, 9 major deficiencies. Oh dear. And hers was like, no, this is not 37. And oh, by the way, they didn't say anything about these more important things. Like, they didn't comment on this, they didn't comment on this, and those would have been hard. These are not hard. And so you're like, oh, okay. And that's a classic fresh hot data. And getting somebody else to help you interpret it who has more experience with that particular kind of data.
That's such a spot on experience, yeah, to recognize that this thing coming in, you don't know the magnitude of it until you've really processed it. Well, we were talking earlier, Jen, and it might be interesting to bring in at this point, as long as we're on FDA. You have a very interesting perspective, and I think it's great. And right now, in the middle of COVID, it's very hard to implement, but we can go as far as we can. I think the words you said were, if you're going to talk to FDA, get on an airplane. Mm-hmm.
That's right. To get to the point where we're at right now, we went through 3 pre-subs. 2 of them were in-person meetings, and 1 was on the phone. And what I concluded after 3 pre-sub meetings with the FDA experiences was, I'm going to go get on a plane anytime I can to meet with the FDA. And that's because there is a interpersonal connection. I think the FDA has moved from a place of being this kind of monolithic government agency to being a group of people. And you are engaging and interacting with that group of people. And there is a difference when you are able to be in the same room with them. There is an opportunity to chat while you're walking from the security desk to the office or the room. And there's a body language thing that happens that's really hard to interpret when you're on the phone, because you can't see them. Now, I don't know if the FDA does Zoom calls. Haven't discovered whether they are into Zoom or not.
They generally won't turn their video on. They generally go audio only.
Okay, well, there you go. This would be the problem, because in the last meeting we had in person with the FDA, there was a moment when our lead reviewer was sitting there and he was being peppered by critical questions from some of his subject matter experts. And he looked at me across the table and he said, Jen, do you have some preliminary data on that subject, perhaps, that you might share with us? And I looked at him and I said, I think we do. I had no idea if we did, but I knew we would by the time we wrote our minutes. I figured we probably could come up with something. And I said, absolutely. And that opened up the opportunity. So he was handing me a gift. And he didn't have to ask the question. He didn't have to ask for the extra data, but he was giving me an out. And it would have been much harder to hear him. I don't even think we would have had it. The other piece of feedback that I've been learning about is the feedback I've gotten from the FDA consultants who are there all the time and really understand the people of the FDA have helped me to understand. And they have talked about it's really important for the FDA to believe in our sincerity. And they said, you're doing a good job because, and this was what was the most interesting to me, because you sound like you care what they think and you want to give them what they need and you want to do the right thing. And those are things that are easier to communicate through body language and in person than they are either in writing or audio only, because it's the way you sit, it's the eye contact that you make that builds that kind of trust. And I thought it was very interesting when I got that feedback from two different FDA consultants that that's what they thought went really well about that meeting. And so it's become a bigger focus for me is that your intention, your sincerity matters to the FDA, because there's nothing in the guidance that says that.
Yeah, everyone wants to think there's just a checklist, but I love your anecdotes there, because we'd like to think of, at some level, we'd like to think of government as well. Everything always happens exactly the same way, but you're dealing with people, they're humans. Yeah, and they're dealing with often deep scientific and clinical questions, and so it's good to be human in those.
And I think they want to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. I have felt from the first encounter with our lead reviewer that he wanted to help us find a path through the maze. And I still believe that that is his goal, even though the ways the questions are written, some of the feedback is written, you sit there and you think, oh, they're just trying to kill us. And that's some of the stuff that you can glean out of being there in person. We know that we have a picky reviewer. We know that he has a high bar. We know this because our consultant deals with him all the time, and she's like, that's who this is. But we also know that he wants us to succeed at some kind of visceral level, but he can't say that. So he has to communicate that through body language and tone. And we have to communicate back through body language and tone that we want him to succeed too.
Yeah, and that's important because they do have metrics and they do have expectations put upon them, and they've got to do a job for the public. And so to recognize that role and to honor it and to handle it accordingly is huge. I want to give our listeners a chance, for the sake of time as well. Great. If they have any questions for Jen, I would love for you to raise your hand. But while we're waiting for those to come in, what I'd like to do is I'd like to hear a little bit about Fifth Eye, because what you guys are doing is so cool. You've got this Analytic for hemodynamic instability. It's a medical device software. Tell us more. So
that's exactly right. We are a medical device software, so we're FDA regulated, and it was something developed in emergency medicine at Michigan Medicine. We formed a company with 3 people that rolled out and took full-time roles with the company, and we use a single lead of EKG to predict patient deterioration using a machine learning trained model. And we have a product built and under review by the FDA. Hopefully we'll get clearance this year on that and be able to start deploying it. And it is fascinating to talk to the doctors and nurses who are the target users for this, because every one of them is like, this isn't information we have currently. And they're super excited about the opportunity to have it. And so it's been a really interesting journey I've learned so much about the tech space, the FDA space. I've been in healthcare for a long time, but not in this level of depth. I think one of the things that's really been interesting for me personally has just been how fast technology is advancing and how software is being built, and how to communicate that to the FDA has been an interesting process, because actually the FDA's conception of software is it dates from a time pre what currently is done. And so it's an interesting process to try and figure out how to do the right thing and to get the FDA what they need, and figure out how to navigate those pieces. But it's been a fun venture backed, and we are hopefully going to market very soon.
That's very cool. I want to give the audience a chance. If you have any questions for Jen, feel free to raise your hand in the meeting. Yeah, I'll give one more second for that. It's interesting, I think what you said about FDA and software is so true, because it's true about almost anything that FDA looks at, that they're often looking to you for an understanding of the latest, like what have you guys been discovering?
Mm-hmm.
They want to learn too, and software is just even beyond a lot of areas there, where how on earth are we going to regulate stuff like this? It becomes a very challenging thing. There's a lot of, I'm sure you guys have run into, be it cybersecurity and HIPAA issues and other things like that. We do have a question here from Ken Spencer. Ken, I'm going to make you live.
Hi, Ken.
Hi, Jen. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Great, thanks. Hey, so on the software front, the FDA published some time ago, here's how we're going to relook at software or something like that, but it was just guidance. It was never,
Mm-hmm.
And has that made any progress, or is it still just sort of guidance?
Well, it's guidance, because I don't think I think that's as far as the FDA goes, although somebody else might be more expert on it. But that particular guidance, I think I've read, and I actually asked our FDA consultant about it, and she owned it, because she spent 17 years at the FDA and she wrote it. So, because I was asking her, I said, does this guidance, because it's pretty old, I said, does it still apply? Is there anything more up to date? And she's like, nope, still applies. So I think the answer is that's the best state of affairs. One of the things that we learned in our submitting, one of the things we did not get feedback on from the FDA was anything related to our software documentation. We got no questions on that. So I think our consultant guided us through that. But what was interesting is we use a tremendous amount of automated testing to make sure that our software, every time we integrate new software, it gets tested thoroughly. And then we're getting ready to package that for the FDA, and our consultant's like, you don't have user acceptance testing that it has a human point and click their way through your application. And we're like, yeah, but we have these automated tests that check every one of those point and clicks, like in spades. And she's like, yeah, but the FDA doesn't know that. So you actually need, so we built a user acceptance test suite that mirrored our automated test suite that a human being would point and click their way through. And we actually had to submit that as well. So that's the kind of thing where you go, really? This is a little odd, because actually the way we're doing it is more thorough than the way we needed to do it for FDA. But FDA is still learning about these kinds of techniques. And so I think that is an interesting conundrum. And the place I landed was, we're going to do both, because we'll do what the FDA wants, but our software, we need to feel confident about it. And this is how we can feel confident about it. And then the question was, well, how much of the detail do you give to the FDA? And then I'm like, but we can be audited, and I don't want there to be any gap between what we do and what we're telling the FDA about. So we're going to do both and figure out a way to explain it in a good way. And I think we accomplished that because they didn't have any questions. So, but it's an interesting dynamic, because some of the things they're asking you to do are like 10 years old from a software development state of the art.
Right. I remember them asking me to document our waterfall technique, right? And they were like,
there you go.
in the 70s, and nobody did it then.
Yeah, exactly. Waterfall. And there is some implication. The way their guidance is written is very waterfall. And I think this has a lot to do with how people think startups are like the same thing as software development waterfall, right? At the beginning, you're going to know all this stuff about your customer, and then you're going to document all your requirements, and you're going to go build it, and then you're going to go ship it. And this is not how reality works, because you constantly are learning new things about your product. To jump back to Accuri days, we actually had a product we thought was ready to go. We got unexpected beta test, fresh hot data, beta test results. That's actually the story that I talk about in that blog post, where we discovered that we had a whole category of requirements that we didn't know about and didn't realize were important, and we were failing. And so we ended up having to step back, take 6 months, fix those things before we were ready to launch the product. And that kind of dynamic is hard to document, but it's very real. And I think that a lot of things about startup education kind of assume waterfall because it's logical and everybody can kind of get their heads wrapped around a waterfall process, but actually waterfall isn't how any of this stuff actually works.
Not how software is developed. Ken, thanks for the question. We have another question here. I don't know if this is public information or not, but we can let you decide how to handle it. Question was, how much funding to market? What does it take to get a company like this to market in terms of funding? Is that a on point or off?
No, that's
question?
fair. And are we talking about Fifth Eye? I don't know.
I think that was the nature of the question by default.
So we've actually, this is public. We've raised 11.5 million into Fifth Eye. We have a press release on that, and I have no reason to think that isn't going to get us to market, because we are actually, that was a tranche round. That's not actually in the press release, and we're about to pull our second tranche at the point when we get FDA clearance, and that will be the money that we use to actually go to market. So I have every reason to think that that 11.5 million will get us to market.
Get you there. That's wonderful. Well, Jen, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your coming on MedTech Crossroads today. I think you've got so many stories. We could do this, 3 weeks in a row, and maybe at some point in the future, as you guys go through more and have more stories that will eventually become more public to share, we would love to have you back on and talk more.
Well, Gina, thank you so much. It is fun to connect with our friends in this space and encourage everybody to build successful companies, because that's how everything advances, in my view.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations on what you're doing, and we wish you the best as you get to the next stage with the agency. Thanks for being here.
All right. I can't wait to hear your story. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Always love hearing from Jen. She's an absolute powerhouse, and we're so proud of what they're doing at Fifth Eye. We're going to take just a few minutes next and switch over to the world. We're just having nothing but technological difficulties here today. We're going to share this desktop. We're going to go here, and we're going to go here. We started the conversation last week in the realm of risk analysis. We made a very broad sweep on risk analysis, but today we're going to tell a story of hazards. And I want to give thanks to Rick Routson, who originated a number of these slides for a presentation that we use with many clients. We're going to start here. Hazards exist when using a medical device. You see the patient here surrounded by hazards, many things that can go wrong. And we're defining terms here. Hazards lead to potential harms to the patient. You can have hazards like thermal energy, and imagine your device generates thermal energy, but a temperature control fails, and the temperature starts to increase to a level that's dangerous for the patient. Well, the hazardous situation that comes out of that is that you might have more thermal energy than the patient can absorb. As a result, the patient's skin is burned. That would be what we call a harm. That's the harm to the patient. So the first thing you should recognize is that a hazard is different from a harm. A hazard is a harm waiting to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. The harm is when the patient's actually hurt. And if we think about the combination of the likelihood of that harm happening and the severity of it, I do care more about someone dying than about someone stubbing their toe. The analysis of those together is really what we think of as risk. Now, you've heard us talk about risk many times on this show, and you might know that the standard, the de facto standard for risk in the US and really worldwide, it's ISO 14971, the 2007 version of that. That has been the risk management standard, well, since about back then. But it's being supplanted now by ISO 14971 2019. That is one that is now recognized by FDA, and the 2007 version is going to phase out for use by December 25th of 2022. So here's where we get to story time. There's a beautiful, and you may think I'm crazy for saying it, but there's a beautiful section in ISO 14971 2007. It's called Annex C, and it really is a walkthrough of story. That is now considered Annex A, or something very similar to it, is now considered Annex A in the ISO 24971 standard, which gives more information on the current ISO 14971 2019 standard. And I want to make an analogy for you, because you probably hear me talking about risk and you hear me talking about story, and you say, Gene, have you lost your mind? Risk is a very technical thing, and story is very loose. And let me make a quick analogy here. It's a rough one, but in a story, we have things like characters, we have settings, we have plots, we have conflict, we have a theme, we have a point of view, we have tone, we have resolution, we have all these aspects that we can look at. And a good story writer would no more ignore one of these than just throw the story in the trash. You want to be thinking about these if you're going to write a good story. Do I have an antagonist, and what are they? What is my protagonist? What's the setting of the thing? What's the point of view? Is it written from the first person, or is it written from the third person? How are we seeing this story? Those are things that matter. And if you're a good story writer, you're going to think about those, and you're going to make decisions about those as you go through. Well, think about this. When it comes to hazards, those things that could bring harm to a patient, thus providing a risk environment, you want to think about things like the intended use, the environment, the materials of the product, the energy use, the reusability of the product, the duration of use of the product. Is the product automatic? Does it have accessories? Do you see the analogy here? There's things that we can say ahead of time you might want to think about. And now this is not the sum of risk management by any means, but it's a neat starting point that the standards give us. And again, it's contained in Annex A of 24971 under the 14971 2019 standard. I want to give you some examples of how this works. Let's take a look at something like intended use. You might have contraindications for the product. It might be life-sustaining, or it might not be. You might need special intervention in case of a failure of the product. Each of these facts will change the risk profile of the device. If there's a special contraindication where you definitely wouldn't want to use this device, does it up the patient's risk to not have some mitigations in place around that? Well, you bet it does. That's a part of this device's hazard story. Is it life-sustaining? Well, if it's not, we don't have to worry as much. But a device that's life-sustaining, that's a part of the story too. What are we going to do if the device fails? What mitigations are we going to put in place? It's an important part of the device's story. How will you intervene in case of a failure? Maybe you don't need to. Maybe there's no adverse event that could happen that really rises to a level that matters. But maybe there is, in which case that's a part of the story. And the standard walks through these questions for you. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Can you just rule this out? And if you can't, maybe you want to dig a little deeper into this area. Here's some more examples. Is the device implanted? Factors you might want to consider there. Where is it implanted? First of all, if it's not implanted, great, that just reduces the risk. If it is, where is it implanted? What kind of a patient population is it implanted in? What are the things that could happen as the device ages as an implant? How long is it expected to last, etc.? What if the device is measuring? and measures a parameter, then you have to start to think about things like whether the device has to be calibrated. Does it have to be maintained in a certain way? These are risks that you're going to have to think about that can bring hazards to the patient. The hazard becomes, what if the device no longer measures accurately? What are the implications of that? What harm can that bring to the patient? What risk does that manifest? And of course, the question for the company is, how would we mitigate it? Does the device interpret? This is a really important one. And we see so many times that people say, oh, I want to take some diagnosis out of the hands of the doctor. I want this device to make the diagnosis. Well, it's a great and admirable goal sometimes, but oftentimes what we're really looking at is something that gives an indicator to a doctor so that they can still make the diagnosis. It's often a hurdle too high to force the device to make the diagnosis. The amount of data that would be required to be able to do that is oftentimes prohibitive. What about, just a few more examples here, maintenance or calibration? Is your device going to require maintenance or calibration? If not, well, that's great, but if it does, that's a hazard you have to think about. What about, like Jen and I were just talking about, the presence of software? There's many things that can happen with software, and it does present a hazard to the user. The question is what hazard and how big, and the standard gives you some ways to think about that. What if the device stores critical patient care data? That's another thing to think about. All these are just ways that people who think about risk management have identified that devices can bring hazards to patients. It's like that writing textbook that teaches you some of the basics about a story so that you can go and say, well, what kind of a character do I have? What kind of characteristics do they have? What kind of a plot am I going to put in place? How am I going to resolve this story? It's the same sort of thing. You've got people who've done this thinking, and if you go to that annex, you've got a checklist of questions that you can ask. Is this true about my device? How about this? What's the implication of this? And it's a great head start as you think about risk management for your medical device. Just one word about that. Risk management. A lot of people will say, oh, risk management, that's failure mode and effects analysis. I'm familiar with that table. Well, FMEA is not risk management. FMEA and fault trees and other things are tools for risk management. At core, risk management is a story. It's a story supported by increasing levels of evidence that your device's benefits outweigh the risks, like we've talked about in other segments. And so once again, these two things are really inseparable. The development process and the regulatory process. Your team has to understand the risks, and before the risks, the hazards associated with your device, and then start to think about how you're going to deal with them, how you're going to mitigate them in the design of the device. And resources like the new ISO 14971 2019 and its corollary standard 24971 give you resources to do just that, so you don't have to do it from absolute scratch, thinking about it as though nothing had ever existed ever before. So hopefully that's useful. A little bit more education, as we always like to do, on FDA matters. And I want to go to our listeners one more time, as we always do at the end. And I want to see if there are any questions about either risks or about other things that we've talked about on the show. This is your chance. Just raise your hand if you have a question. And not seeing any questions today, I want to thank you all again for being with us. Sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but it was great to talk to Jen and good to think about you, think about risk with you guys. Have a great day.